Good morning. We are starting week 11 of the Cultural Geography of the United Kingdom, and today's subject is quite a big one, and it can be tackled from quite a few different perspectives. And what I mean is history as inspiration for travel, for the tourist industry, and the long history of Britain, the institutions that take care of the historical places, and especially historical residences. But what I would like to start with is Royal Britain. So the royal connections still imprinted on the land of Great Britain and Watson. And the connections between geography and monarchy. So, of course, the further back we go in history, the more difficult it is to find complete buildings. There are quite a lot of ruined castles and churches because, of course, if we move back in history, it's mostly the castles, the residences, and ecclesiastical buildings, so churches, abbeys, cathedrals, that were connected with the royal history. We could go very far back in history to pre-Norman times, even perhaps to pre-Roman times, if you think about that. You may be tempted to look again at the part on historical maps and the names of all the little kingdoms and lands that were in Britain, but for the sake of today's discussion, I will start in the late pre-Norman Britain, so the Anglo-Saxon Britain. I hope you recognize some of the places already, but today we'll see them from the perspective of the British history and especially the royal history. I found also quite an interesting documentary film called Royal Britain from above, seen from above. It's actually the whole idea that they are probably using drones to film the places connected with British royal history. I uploaded it to. I put the link to Moodle to this documentary, so you can find it hopefully. Of course, anything about the royal history of Britain. They visit the residences, they visit the places connected with the royalty, and you can find quite a lot of visual materials to accompany today's class. So let's start in pre-Norman Britain. So the two probably most well-known historical kings. We'll talk about King Arthur when we talk about legendary Britain, because I think he was more legendary than historical. But the names from British royal history before the Norman conquest, before William the Conqueror, that usually spring to mind when people are asked are Edward the Confessor, so the king whose death is depicted on the Bayeux Tapestry, and we even have the funeral of King Edward the Confessor in the newly built Westminster Abbey. So of course Westminster Abbey being the beautiful surviving Gothic cathedral, a UNESCO site in its own right, is also very strongly connected with the royal history. It has been a place of royal coronations for centuries, and also a place of the entombment of many British monarchs, although not all of them. There are in fact many places where British kings and queens are buried, and we are going to talk about some of these places today. But Westminster Abbey is one of such places, connected, as I said, to the Anglo-Saxon, late Anglo-Saxon, last Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor. Earlier, we also have a royal connection and the tomb to a great cathedral in one of the capital cities of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, that is Winchester, the city associated with King Alfred the Great, the great unifier of England, also remembered for his victory over the Viking forces. So quite famously he conquered the Danes, as the history remembers. So the Viking forces, his capital city was in Winchester. You may recall the castle and also the cathedral, one of the beautiful, best preserved, and actually the oldest cathedrals in England. Then we have the Norman conquest, the new dynasty on the throne, the Norman dynasty, so connected to the Vikings, you might say again. And what we have is a whole movement or a big project of castle building, first of all. So the castles of William I, William the Conqueror, the most important, of course, being the Tower of London, another very well-known historical monument in London, which served many different purposes over the centuries, but was originally built as a royal residence in London. So the oldest part, the White Tower, the keep of the tower, comes from the early Norman period. We can also visit Battle Abbey in Hastings, the place of the famous Battle of Hastings. After the battle, a church was built, a monastery was built to pray for the fallen knights on both sides, basically, and it was built in a village called Battle, near Hastings. So that the battle would be remembered. It is still one of the most remembered military conflicts on English soil. Then, as I said, William I embarked on a large project of building castles. We have two images here, Colchester and Lincoln. These were the castles that were built by the Normans on the orders of the king, usually given to his barons, the Norman nobility, who would replace the old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, and many castles were built or rebuilt in this period. Here we have some names of other castles. You may want to look them up. The castles of Pevensey, Dover, Windsor Castle comes from this period. We'll talk about it later, of course. Old Sarum, Durham, York, Norwich. These were all the castles built by William I. And of course, not all of them survive in good condition. Until today, they were destroyed by various conflicts. The most important, the most devastating conflicts that destroyed many of those fortifications during the British history were the Wars of the Roses in the Middle Ages, and then the Civil War in the 17th century, but some of them survived in relatively good condition. Some of them are picturesque ruins which you can visit still. The next king that I'd like to remind you is King Henry II from the Plantagenet dynasty that kind of developed from the Normans, and he is the king who's mostly connected to the history of Canterbury Cathedral in Kent, and of course the whole story of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, murdered by the Knights of King Henry II, and of course the very public penance that the king had to do. He had to do a pilgrimage to the cathedral, and of course pay a lot of money in compensation to the church, which was mostly used to develop this beautiful Gothic cathedral, one of the most important places of pilgrimage. So we talked about it a little bit when we talked about the UNESCO sites. Of course, it is one of the UNESCO sites. We talked about it when we talked about the places of pilgrimage, and there is a royal connection here as well. We are not going to talk about all the monarchs, it would take too much time. If you want more, you can have more examples in the documentary, or basically watch anything or read a book about any aspect of history of royalty in Britain. I'd like to point to perhaps the most spectacular monuments and most memorable places connected with the kings and queens. So the next one is the king who is quite infamous in British history. He is sometimes called the Bad King John, or John the Lackland. He was the younger brother of the great Crusader king Richard the Lionheart, and he is mostly remembered for two things that happened during his life. One is the Magna Carta, the Charter of Rights. He was basically forced to sign by his barons at a place near London called Runnymede. So here we have, there's actually I think a postcard showing different monuments around the site of Runnymede. Then he was quite infamous for allowing the regalia, the royal jewels, to be lost at sea in one of the bays of on the eastern coast of England called the Wash. You may recall the Wash, it's near Norfolk, and somewhere there on the bottom of the sea, the English royal jewels are still there. They were never recovered, so there were many expeditions trying to find them, but they are still unrecovered. When King John died, finally, he was buried in Worcester Cathedral, so not in London, not in Windsor, as you'll see, which also is the place of royal burials until today, really, quite recently. Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth II, was buried there, but there are other places like Worcester Cathedral, one of the respectable but smaller Gothic cathedrals in England, where some of the monarchs are buried. Then we have King Edward I, the great lawgiver and also unifier of of Great Britain. He conquered Wales, he tried to conquer Scotland, he was not successful. His son Edward II was also not successful in conquering Scotland, although they tried. But his campaign, Edward I's campaign in Wales, was very successful. You may recall the story of the Prince of Wales and the introduction of English rule in Wales, and also the Ring of Iron, the ring of castles in Wales that Edward I ordered to be built. Some of these castles, 4 castles, have UNESCO status. We talked about them a little: Beaumaris, Conwy, Carnarvon and Harlech. Most of them, like Beaumaris and Carnarvon, I think Conwy as well, were built by the orders of King Edward I. Harlech was originally Welsh castle built by Welsh nobility, but it survived in quite good condition, even though it was subjected to one of the longest sieges in British history. So that's it. There are, of course, lots of castles in Wales, many of them coming from this period, so either built by Edward I or by the Welsh nobility who tried to fight him. Many of them are in ruined state, but still very picturesque. If you recall our discussion of landscape painting and the romantic landscape, especially the castles of Wales were very inspirational for artists. We have some more names here: Flint, Rhuddlan, Aberystwyth and Cardigan. You can Google them if you want to. Here we have the castles of Wales. Speaking of King Edward II, the man who tried to conquer Scotland and was repelled by the Scots under King Robert the Bruce. You may recall there was quite a long time ago, but a very, very good historical novel by a French author, Maurice Drouin, The Cursed Kings. It tells the story about the beginning and the reasons for the 100 Years' War between England and France. And actually, Edward II is very important here because he had a claim to the French throne for England through his wife, who was a French princess called Isabella, and of course their son Edward III. So when the brothers of Isabella died, leaving no heirs, Edward II tried to get the throne of France by the rights of his wife. Unfortunately, in France, sisters, women, could not inherit the throne, so it passed to the sideline of the royal family in France. Edward II is quite a scandalous figure in British history. He was probably homosexual. He had some rather scandalous liaisons with his courtiers, which made him very unpopular, and of course the wronged wife, Queen Isabella, she sided with some of the English nobles. She actually took one of them as her lover, and they staged basically a coup d'etat in which Edward was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, called Edward III. He was imprisoned in Gloucestershire in Berkeley Castle, so you can see the castle here, and he was probably murdered, and according to some historical sources, he was murdered in a particularly gruesome way because he had hot poker stuck up his backside, so a painful and very degrading death, probably alluding to his sexual orientation. The king, or the deposed king, was buried in Gloucester Cathedral, so another beautiful Gothic cathedral. Here we have the tomb of King Edward II. There is a story that perhaps he survived. He was allowed to become a monk, and there are all kinds of tales connected to this monarch, also in literature, if you think about that. But here are the places connected with the very sad history of the very unfortunate king. So Berkeley Castle, where he was imprisoned and likely killed, and Gloucester Cathedral, where he was buried. His son Edward III was more successful. He was successful as a war leader. So the war with France, the beginning of the 100 Years' War, which he fought for the lands that, according to his perception of the law, should belong to his mother. Unfortunately, the mother herself was deposed and imprisoned. Actually, she was held until her death in this castle, now in ruined state, called Castle Rising in Norfolk. Edward III became a long-reigning and quite successful king. He married a Flemish princess called Philippa, and the spectacular royal wedding was celebrated in yet another beautiful Gothic cathedral called York Minster. So York Cathedral, it was not yet completely finished, so it was a kind of advanced building site, let's put it this way. When the royal pair was married, they wanted to give some royal spectacle basically to the north of England, and of course York is much further to the north than London. Some of the places, some of the castles have a very long tradition, and they served many generations of British kings and queens, and one of such places, which is now a very large and quite spectacular ruin, is Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire. And this is one of those places that couldn't be really linked to one monarch, because it served many monarchs. The first castle was built there by the Normans. Then it survived a long siege in the mid-13th century during Henry the Second's reign. There was a civil war with the barons. It happened quite often in the Middle Ages. Important aristocrats were rich enough to have private armies, and sometimes they opposed the kings. They sided with the royal princes and King Henry II, so the unfortunate king who is linked to the murder of Thomas Becket, was also plagued by the Civil War. So this castle was besieged then. This is where Edward II, so the homosexual king, you might say, was deposed and arrested. So before he was taken to Berkeley, he was arrested there in Kenilworth. Then it belonged to the grandfather of Henry V, the great warrior king, called John of Gaunt, one of the great aristocrats, the Duke of Lancaster, and Henry V used this castle quite a lot, and this is where a very famous scene, also immortalized in the play by Shakespeare, happened. Namely, this is where he received a gift of tennis balls from France, from his cousin, signifying that the French believed him to be a harmless young boy who should play games rather than think of conquering France and capturing the French throne. This, of course, resulted in the renewed lease of warfare with France. After the castle remained in the House of Lancaster, so during the War of the Roses, the so-called Cousins' War between the houses of Lancaster and York, both linked to the royal family, this was a stronghold for the Lancaster side. Later in the Tudor period, it was given to the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley, one of the closest advisors and favorites of Queen Elizabeth I, and he memorably held a splendid banquet and ball for the Queen, who visited him and stayed for quite a long time. It was entertained there. It was finally destroyed during the Civil War, so in the Stuart period, when the King Charles I fought against the forces of the Parliament led by Oliver Cromwell. So here we have one castle, now in the ruined state, serving many generations, indeed many dynasties of the British royals. If we speak of the Wars of the Roses, here we have some castles that were important there. So some of them that were destroyed, some of them that were besieged. If you want more detailed story here, I encourage you to watch the documentary, or perhaps to Google those names. They have very long history, so perhaps the Wars of the Roses were an important episode in their long history. But for example, Bamburgh Castle in Northumberland was once a royal seat for the kings of Northumbria. Quite a lot of these castles are in the north, because this is where the fighting took place. Alnwick Castle, the place that was used recently for filming such productions as Harry Potter, is also one of these castles. Warwick Castle, held by the Duke of Warwick, the famous kingmaker, one of the most important noblemen during this period. And of course, the last place is not a castle, it is a battlefield, the place marked by the stone here, Bosworth Field in Leicestershire, where King Richard III was killed in the Battle of Bosworth. He was killed by the forces of Henry VII, Henry Tudor, and he was buried in Leicester, in one of the churches, not even the cathedral, in Leicester. A few years ago his body was recovered and found quite unexpectedly during some road works, and it was studied, identified as the body of the king, and moved to Leicester Cathedral. And we continue in a moment.